In the suffocating heat of August 1857, Galveston Island lay suspended between the Gulf of Mexico and the Texas mainland, like a forgotten memory caught in amber. The salt-laden air carried more than the usual scent of maritime commerce and tropical decay. It carried secrets that had festered in the humid darkness for 3 decades, waiting for their appointed time to surface once more. The island's inhabitants moved through their daily routines with the unconscious wariness of prey animals, their collective memory scarred by events that official records had carefully omitted. Yellow fever epidemics were common enough along the Gulf Coast, but what had visited Galveston in 1827 defied the neat categories that medical science preferred to maintain. The port city bustled with its usual commerce, cotton merchants and ship captains conducting their business beneath the oppressive August sun. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, something primordial stirred in the shadows cast by the grand Victorian homes that lined the tree-shaded streets. The older residents, those who had witnessed the previous visitation, found themselves checking locks twice and avoiding certain neighborhoods after sunset. They spoke in hushed tones of the Beaumont family estate on the island's eastern shore, where Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from ancient oak trees. The mansion had stood empty for 30 years, its windows boarded and its gardens surrendered to the creeping wilderness of the Texas coast. Dr. Ezekiel Morrison, recently arrived from Boston to serve as the island's new physician, noticed the peculiar behavior of his patients almost immediately. They came to his clinic with complaints that seemed to have no physical origin: insomnia, sudden chills in the sweltering heat, and a persistent feeling of being watched. The more established doctors in town dismissed these symptoms as the inevitable result of living in such an isolated and humid climate. Yet Morrison, trained in the latest scientific methods, found himself documenting patterns that defied rational explanation. His medical journal, discovered decades later in the ruins of his practice, would provide the only systematic record of what transpired during those final weeks of August. The Beaumont estate had once been the crown jewel of Galveston society, built by a wealthy plantation owner who had moved his operations to the island in the early 1820s. Jeremiah Beaumont had arrived with his wife, Margaret, and their 3 young children, seeking to establish a cotton empire that would rival anything found on the mainland. The family had prospered initially, their sprawling mansion becoming the center of the island's social life. Yet by the autumn of 1827, the Beaumont name had become synonymous with tragedy and inexplicable loss. The official cause of the family's demise was listed as yellow fever, but those who had witnessed the events firsthand carried memories that contradicted the sanitized version recorded in the county clerk's office. As August 1857 progressed, the island's residents began to experience phenomena that seemed to echo events from 3 decades past. Children reported seeing figures in the abandoned Beaumont gardens, pale shapes that moved among the overgrown hedgerows with purposeful intent. Fishermen returning from the Gulf at dawn spoke of lights moving through the mansion's shuttered windows, soft illumination that flickered like candle flames before vanishing entirely. The island's newspaper, the Galveston Weekly Tribune, initially dismissed these accounts as the product of overactive imaginations and the oppressive heat. Yet even the editor, a pragmatic man named Charles Whitmore, found himself walking different routes home after several unsettling encounters near the Beaumont property. The Galveston Historical Society's archives, housed in a modest brick building near the courthouse, contained documents that painted a disturbing picture of the island's cyclical tragedies. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the society's elderly curator, had spent decades organizing the collected papers, letters, and official records that chronicled the community's development. Among these materials were several accounts of the 1827 incidents that had never been intended for public consumption. Personal letters, Diary entries and confidential reports from city officials revealed a pattern of events that bore little resemblance to the yellow fever epidemic described in newspapers of that era. These documents, yellowed with age and spotted with mildew from the humid coastal climate, suggested that something far more sinister had visited the Beaumont family. Margaret Beaumont's final letters to her sister in Charleston painted a picture of mounting dread and inexplicable occurrences. She wrote of servants who fled the estate without explanation, leaving behind personal belongings and wages owed to them. The children had begun experiencing nightmares of such intensity that they refused to sleep alone, huddling together in their parents' bedroom while strange sounds echoed through the mansion's corridors. Most disturbing were Margaret's descriptions of her husband's deteriorating mental state, as Jeremiah became convinced that something was systematically destroying his family from within. His own journal entries, discovered hidden behind a false wall during renovations in the 1870s, chronicled his desperate attempts to understand the force that seemed to be methodically claiming his loved ones. The pattern that emerged from these historical documents was both specific and terrifying in its implications. Every 30 years, beginning in 1797, according to fragmentary Spanish colonial records, the area that would become Galveston had experienced a period of unexplained deaths and disappearances. The cycle seemed to center around late August, when the oppressive heat and humidity reached their annual peak. Previous incidents had been attributed to various causes: Indian raids, pirate attacks, disease outbreaks, but the consistency of the timing suggested something more deliberate than natural disaster or human conflict. The Spanish missionaries who had first attempted to establish a presence on the island had abandoned their efforts after losing an entire congregation under circumstances that their reports described only as manifestaciones diabolicas. Dr. Morrison's growing obsession with these historical precedents led him to seek out the few remaining witnesses to the 1827 events. Most had long since died or departed the island, but he managed to locate Sarah Whitlock, an elderly woman who had served as a nursemaid in the Beaumont household. Her testimony, recorded in Morrison's meticulous handwriting, provided details that transformed the official narrative from medical tragedy to something far more disturbing. She described children who had aged decades in a matter of days, their hair turning white and their young faces etched with lines of premature aging. The family members had not succumbed to fever, but had instead seemed to waste away, as if some invisible force was drawing the very essence of life from their bodies. The city records from 1827 showed an unusual number of death certificates signed by multiple physicians, suggesting that the medical community had been unable to reach consensus about the causes of mortality. Several doctors had noted symptoms that defied contemporary understanding of disease progression, including cases where patients exhibited signs of extreme old age despite being in the prime of life. One physician's notes, barely legible after decades of storage, mentioned temporal distortions and accelerated cellular decay that seemed to affect only certain individuals. These medical mysteries had been quietly suppressed, their details deemed too disturbing or inexplicable to include in official reports that might damage the island's reputation as a safe haven for commerce and settlement. As August 1857 entered its final week, the atmospheric pressure on Galveston Island seemed to increase with each passing day. The usual sea breezes that provided relief from the summer heat had stagnated, leaving the air thick and oppressive. Residents found themselves short of breath during even minor exertions, and many complained of persistent headaches that no amount of laudanum could relieve. Dr. Morrison documented these symptoms in his journal, noting their similarity to accounts from the 1827 incident. The physician had become increasingly convinced that the island was experiencing the early stages of another visitation, Though he struggled to define exactly what form this phenomenon might take, the children of Galveston were the first to exhibit signs of the approaching crisis. Teachers at the island's small schoolhouse reported that their students had become listless and distracted, staring out windows with expressions of profound unease. Several children claimed to see figures moving through the abandoned Beaumont estate, describing pale forms that beckoned to them from behind the rusted iron gates. Parents initially dismissed these accounts as typical childhood fantasies, but the consistency of the descriptions began to trouble even the most skeptical adults. The children all spoke of the same figure, a woman in a tattered dress who stood among the overgrown gardens, her arms outstretched as if inviting them to approach. Margaret Beaumont's ghost, if indeed that was what the children were witnessing, seemed to be following the same pattern that had preceded the 1827 tragedy. Historical accounts suggested that the supernatural manifestations had begun with sightings of deceased family members, followed by increasingly direct attempts at contact with the living. The progression was both gradual and inexorable, building toward a climax that coincided with the anniversary of the original deaths. Dr. Morrison's research had uncovered references to a specific date, August 28th, that appeared repeatedly in various historical documents. This date had marked the final night of the Beaumont family's ordeal and seemed to represent some kind of temporal focal point for the mysterious forces at work. The island's animal population provided another indicator of the approaching danger. Dogs refused to walk near the Beaumont estate, growling and retreating when their owners attempted to lead them down the tree-lined avenue that approached the mansion. Horses became increasingly skittish, particularly those stabled in the eastern section of town, where the abandoned property cast its longest shadows. Even the seabirds that normally filled the sky above Galveston seemed to avoid the area around the estate, creating an eerie silence that contrasted sharply with the cacophony of wildlife elsewhere on the island. These behavioral changes, while initially subtle, became more pronounced as the month progressed toward its ominous conclusion. The weather itself seemed to reflect the mounting tension, with sudden shifts in wind direction and brief but violent thunderstorms that appeared without warning. Lightning strikes became increasingly frequent, often targeting the same areas repeatedly in patterns that defied meteorological explanation. The Galveston Weather Station, established just 2 years earlier, recorded atmospheric anomalies that its operators struggled to interpret. Barometric pressure readings fluctuated wildly, and the newly installed telegraph equipment began experiencing interference that seemed to intensify during the nighttime hours. These technical difficulties made communication with the mainland increasingly unreliable, adding to the sense of isolation that was beginning to permeate the island community. The Beaumont family's final week in August 1827 had unfolded with a terrible inevitability that seemed to be repeating itself 30 years later. According to the fragmentary records that Dr. Morrison had assembled, the supernatural manifestations had begun subtly before escalating into direct physical interactions with the living. Jeremiah Beaumont's journal described objects moving without explanation, doors opening and closing of their own accord, and the sound of children's laughter echoing through empty rooms. Most disturbing were his accounts of conversations with family members who had already died, encounters that he initially dismissed as grief-induced hallucinations before accepting their reality. The 3 Beaumont children, Thomas, aged 12, Catherine, aged 9, and little William, who had just celebrated his 6th birthday, had been the focus of the supernatural attention. Their parents' letters described a progression of symptoms that began with nightmares and sleepwalking, but gradually evolved into something far more sinister. The children claimed to be receiving visits from relatives who had died years earlier, deceased grandparents and aunts who urged them to join their family in what they described as a beautiful garden where no one ever grew old or experienced pain. These visitations had initially seemed benevolent, even comforting to children who had been isolated on the island, far from their extended family. Margaret Beaumont's correspondence revealed her growing alarm as she realized that her children were aging at an accelerated rate during these supernatural encounters. Thomas had developed grey streaks in his hair and lines around his eyes that made him appear decades older than his 12 years. Catherine's voice had changed, taking on the rasping quality of an elderly woman, while little William had begun walking with the careful, measured gait of someone whose joints ached with arthritis. The family's physician, Dr. Cornelius Webb, had been baffled by these symptoms, finding no medical explanation for the rapid deterioration he was witnessing. The historical records suggested that the supernatural force at work required some form of temporal exchange, drawing years of life from the living to sustain the existence of the dead. This process seemed to accelerate as the anniversary of the original tragedy approached, creating a feedback loop that became increasingly difficult to escape. Jeremiah Beaumont's final journal entries described his desperate attempts to protect his family by leaving the island, but every effort to depart had been thwarted by circumstances that seemed almost supernaturally orchestrated. Ships were delayed by sudden storms, horses went lame at crucial moments, and family members became too ill to travel just as escape seemed possible. The parallels between the 1827 events and what was occurring in 1857 became impossible to ignore as Dr. Morrison continued his investigation. The same atmospheric disturbances, the same behavioral changes in animals, and most significantly, the same reports of supernatural visitations from deceased family members. The physician had identified several families on the island whose children were exhibiting the premature, aging symptoms that had characterized the Beaumont tragedy. These families shared certain characteristics. They were relative newcomers to the island. They lived in areas that had been uninhabited during the 1827 incident, and their children had all reported seeing the pale woman in the abandoned estate's gardens. The historical pattern that Dr. Morrison had uncovered extended far beyond the well-documented events of 1827, reaching back through decades of incomplete records and oral traditions that painted a picture of cyclical horror. Spanish colonial documents, many partially destroyed by humidity and neglect, contained references to similar occurrences dating back to the late 18th century. The indigenous peoples who had originally inhabited the island had their own legends about the area. Stories of a curse that awakened every generation to claim the lives of the young and innocent. These native accounts, dismissed by European settlers as primitive superstition, described a malevolent presence that fed on the life force of children, growing stronger with each feeding until it could manifest physically in the world of the living. The mechanism of the 30-year cycle remained mysterious, but certain patterns had emerged from Morrison's research. The supernatural activity seemed to require a triggering event, typically the death of an entire family under traumatic circumstances. This initial tragedy created what the Spanish missionaries had termed a temporal wound, a rupture in the normal flow of time that allowed the dead to interact with the living. The wound would then remain dormant for exactly 3 decades before reopening, driven by forces that operated according to laws beyond human understanding. Each reactivation of the cycle drew more victims into its influence, expanding the supernatural presence until it reached some kind of critical mass that allowed for direct physical manifestation. The Beaumont estate had become the focal point for this recurring nightmare, its abandoned rooms and overgrown gardens serving as a kind of dimensional gateway between the world of the living and whatever realm the dead inhabited. The mansion's architecture itself seemed to have been affected by the supernatural presence, with rooms that appeared larger or smaller depending on the time of day and corridors that led to different destinations depending on who walked them. Several brave souls who had explored the property during the intervening years had reported experiencing temporal disorientation, finding themselves in rooms that showed no signs of age or decay despite the building's obvious abandonment. Morrison's attempts to understand the scientific basis for these phenomena had led him to correspond with colleagues at major universities, sharing his observations while carefully omitting the more fantastic elements of his discoveries. The responses he received suggested that similar cyclical events had been reported in other isolated communities, particularly those located on islands or in regions where traumatic historical events had occurred. A professor at Harvard had written about temporal anomalies observed in certain locations where multiple deaths had occurred within short time periods, while a researcher in Edinburgh had documented cases of chronological displacement in areas associated with historical tragedies. The approaching anniversary of the 1827 incident had created an atmosphere of mounting dread throughout Galveston, even among residents who remained unaware of the historical pattern. Business activity had slowed as people found excuses to remain indoors during the daylight hours and avoided venturing out entirely after sunset. The island's churches reported increased attendance, with parishioners seeking comfort in religious services while remaining unable to articulate the source of their growing anxiety. Even the most rational and skeptical members of the community found themselves checking locks and avoiding certain streets without conscious awareness of why they felt compelled to take such precautions. August 26, 1857 marked the beginning of the most active phase of the supernatural cycle, as the boundary between the living and the dead began to dissolve with increasing frequency. Dr. Morrison's journal entries from this period described phenomena that challenged his scientific worldview, while providing detailed observations of events that would have been dismissed as fiction in any other context. The first undeniable manifestation occurred at the Hendricks farmstead, where young Mary Hendricks was discovered in conversation with her deceased grandmother, a woman who had died during the 1827 incident. The child showed clear signs of the accelerated aging that had characterized the Beaumont children, her blonde hair streaked with premature gray, and her face marked by lines that belonged on someone decades older. The supernatural activity was no longer confined to the Beaumont estate, but had begun spreading throughout the eastern section of the island, following patterns that seemed to correspond to underground water sources and natural geological features. Families reported cold spots in their homes despite the oppressive August heat, areas where the temperature dropped so dramatically that their breath became visible. Children throughout the affected neighborhoods began exhibiting signs of what Dr. Morrison termed temporal displacement, aging rapidly during nighttime hours while appearing to recover somewhat during the day. The progression was inexorable but not uniform, affecting some children more severely than others according to factors that remained unclear. The dead who were manifesting during this renewed cycle included not only victims of the 1827 incident, but also individuals who had died during previous iterations of the phenomenon. Margaret Beaumont remained the most frequently cited figure, but she was now accompanied by other pale forms that moved through the abandoned estate with increasing boldness. Witnesses described seeing entire family groups gathered in the mansion's overgrown gardens, their clothing and appearance corresponding to different historical periods stretching back several decades. These gatherings seemed to have a purpose beyond mere manifestation, as if the dead were preparing for some kind of collective action that would coincide with the anniversary of their original tragedy. The island's infrastructure began showing signs of strain as the supernatural activity intensified. Telegraph lines sparked and failed without apparent cause, gas lamps flickered and dimmed despite full reservoirs, and the newly installed water pumps experienced mechanical failures that defied repair attempts. Dr. Morrison noted that these technical difficulties seemed to worsen during the evening hours when supernatural activity reached its peak. The breakdown of communication systems added to the sense of isolation that was gripping the community, cutting off potential avenues for seeking help from mainland authorities who might have provided rational explanations for the increasingly irrational events. Most disturbing were the reports of children who had begun disappearing during the night, only to return before dawn with no memory of where they had been. These absent hours seemed to correspond with periods of accelerated aging, as if the missing time was being somehow compressed or stolen from their natural lifespan. Parents who attempted to prevent these nocturnal absences found their efforts thwarted by supernatural forces that could unlock doors, open windows, and somehow compel their children to leave the safety of their homes. The pattern suggested that the dead were actively recruiting the living to join them, using methods that bypassed conscious resistance while appealing to something deeper than rational thought. August 27th brought with it an oppressive stillness that seemed to muffle sound and slow movement throughout Galveston Island. The supernatural activity that had been building throughout the month reached a crescendo as the anniversary of the original tragedy approached its climax. Dr. Morrison's final coherent journal entries described a town caught in the grip of temporal distortion, where clocks ran backward and shadows fell in directions that defied the position of the sun. The affected children had aged so dramatically that some were barely recognizable to their parents, their young faces transformed into masks of premature senility that reflected decades of compressed experience. The Beaumont estate had become a beacon of supernatural energy, its windows glowing with phosphorescent light that could be seen from miles away. The mansion's grounds were now crowded with manifestations from multiple decades, creating a grotesque gathering of the dead that spanned generations of tragedy. Margaret Beaumont stood at the center of this assembly, her arms still outstretched in the gesture that children had been reporting for weeks. Her purpose had become clear to those brave enough to observe from a distance. She was calling the living to join the dead in whatever timeless realm they inhabited, offering escape from the linear progression of mortality in exchange for the sacrifice of natural life. The town's children, those who had been most severely affected by the temporal displacement, began moving toward the estate with the mechanical precision of sleepwalkers. Their parents and attempts to restrain them proved futile as supernatural forces overrode human will and physical barriers. Dr. Morrison noted that the affected children seemed to be aging in reverse during their final journey, their prematurely elderly features gradually returning to something approaching their natural age as they approached the source of the temporal distortion. This reversal suggested that the supernatural presence was somehow restoring the stolen time before claiming its victims permanently. The climax of the 30-year cycle occurred precisely at midnight on August 28th, when the boundary between life and death collapsed entirely within the confines of the Beaumont estate. Witnesses reported seeing the mansion's windows explode outward in a shower of phosphorescent light, followed by a silence so complete that it seemed to absorb sound from the surrounding area. The manifestations of the dead vanished instantly, taking with them the children who had been drawn into their supernatural gathering. When dawn broke over Galveston Island, the estate appeared exactly as it had 30 years earlier, freshly abandoned but showing no signs of the decay that should have accumulated over 3 decades. Dr. Morrison's investigation ended abruptly with his own disappearance on the morning of August 29th. His journal was found in his clinic, its final entry describing his intention to examine the Beaumont estate in the aftermath of the supernatural convergence. The building showed no signs of struggle or violence, but the physician was never seen again. His medical bag was discovered on the estate's front porch, its contents scattered as if dropped in haste. The only trace of his final hours was a single page of notes, written in his distinctive handwriting, but describing events that seemed to occur from the perspective of someone much older than the 35-year-old physician who had arrived on the island just months earlier. In the decades following the 1857 incident, Galveston Island developed an unofficial policy of collective amnesia regarding the events of that terrible August. Official records made no mention of the missing children or Dr. Morrison's disappearance, instead attributing the summer's troubles to an outbreak of tropical fever that had claimed several young lives. The Beaumont estate was quietly sold to a developer who planned to demolish the mansion and subdivide the property, but construction crews reported such persistent accidents and equipment failures that the project was eventually abandoned. The property reverted to the city, which allowed it to return to its natural state while carefully avoiding any official acknowledgement of why the area remained unsuitable for development. The surviving residents of Galveston carried forward whispered warnings about the 30-year cycle, passing along fragmented accounts of the supernatural pattern to their children and grandchildren. These oral traditions, never committed to writing, preserved essential details about the signs that preceded each manifestation and the methods that might be used to protect vulnerable family members. Young families with children were quietly encouraged to take extended vacations during late August, while older residents made certain to avoid the eastern section of the island during the anniversary period. The collective memory of the community adapted to accommodate a reality that official documentation refused to acknowledge. Researchers who attempted to investigate the Galveston incidents in later years found their efforts systematically frustrated by missing records, damaged documents, and witnesses who claimed to have no knowledge of the events in question. The historical archives that had been so meticulously maintained by Mrs. Hartwell were discovered to have suffered extensive water damage during a hurricane that affected only the building housing the records. Dr. Morrison's medical journals, which might have provided the most detailed account of the supernatural phenomena, disappeared from the abandoned clinic under circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained. Even the church records, typically the most reliable source of historical information, showed gaps and inconsistencies that suggested deliberate editing. The island's development as a major port city proceeded without official recognition of the cyclical danger that threatened its residents every 3 decades. New families arrived regularly, drawn by economic opportunities and unaware of the supernatural legacy they were inheriting. The old-timers who remained watched these newcomers with a mixture of sympathy and resignation, knowing that some would inevitably become involved in the next manifestation of the 30-year cycle. The pattern had established itself too deeply to be broken by human intervention, becoming as much a part of Galveston's natural rhythm as the tides and seasonal storms. As 1887 approached, those who remembered the previous incidents began to notice familiar signs returning to the island. Children reported strange dreams and inexplicable attractions to abandoned areas of the city. Animals exhibited the same behavioral changes that had preceded the 1857 events. Most significantly, the Beaumont estate began showing signs of renewed supernatural activity, with lights visible in its boarded windows and sounds of movement echoing from its empty rooms. The cycle was preparing to complete another revolution, driven by forces that operated according to laws far older and more implacable than anything human civilization had produced. The true horror of the Galveston mystery lay not in any single incident of supernatural violence, but in the inexorable certainty of its return. Every 30 years, without fail, the dead would rise to claim the living, following patterns established by tragedies that stretched back beyond recorded history. The island would endure each visitation and then forget, adapting its collective memory to accommodate the unthinkable while preparing unknowingly for the next cycle of loss. Time itself had become the enemy in Galveston, a force that brought not healing and forgetfulness, but the eternal return of ancient hungers that could never be permanently satisfied. The calendar pages would continue to turn, marking the days and years until August 1887 arrived with its familiar promise of supernatural convergence. And the cycle would begin again, with fresh victims who had never learned the lessons that previous generations had died trying to teach.